Hello and welcome to Soberania, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City, as well as staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, how you doing? Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jose Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States, Sentido Común here in Mexico, ready for another episode of Soberania.
Nice. Yes. I don't even know the couch rag. I don't. It's always a surprise for me too.
Yes, if people behave really well and there's a lot of subscriptions, I promise that I will twirl in the other direction at the end of the show.
You know what I was thinking could be a good one? We should learn how to sign Soberania.
Oh, yeah.
We should ask a friend who knows how. I'm sure someone's out there willing to help us. Or maybe just the letters. We can just learn the letters. Anyway, all right. It's good to be here with you, Kurt, to talk yet another week of developments in Mexican politics here. Bring up here on the screen our rundown for today for Soberania episode 31. It's wild. We've had a lot of episodes now.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to open with Sheinbaum putting a leash on the U.S. ambassador, Ken Salazar, no longer free to do whatever he feels like and talk to whoever he wants, like the way he was accustomed to. I think it's important that we're seeing these kinds of developments of actually asserting here on the second floor of the fourth transformation just how important sovereignty and respect for sovereignty is. We also have some news around a harasser of women, a serial harasser of women who calls himself a cartoonist. He's crying out that he's a victim. He's the victim of state-backed persecution because, well, he crossed the line yet again. And guess what? Some of his behavior crosses into illegality. So it's good to see that there's going to be some action on that file. Neoliberalism in Mexico continues to be rolled back. Some people call the recent news that the formerly productive companies in Mexico, the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, the electricity utility, and the state-owned oil company Pemex, are no longer productive enterprises, but are actually state-owned companies. And it's not just a rhetorical difference. There's actually some consequence behind that, and I think is very indicative of the new times that we are living here in Mexico. And of course, our two segments. Good news from Mexico. We got something about a cute little car that's hopefully going to come out soon. You know, I've been thinking about getting a car. Not anytime soon. Maybe this one will be ready in time for me to make that leap into car ownership here in Mexico. And losers and haters, we're going to pick on David Frum because he sucks. Screw him. And so we're going to spend some time making fun of him.
It's easy and fun. And like all of the internet is doing it as well. So, you know, we can't.
Yeah, let's jump in. And if you feel like making fun of David Frum, go ahead. You know what? I hope it hurts. I hope he cries a little bit into his pillow at the end of the day. Okay. Starting with this news here. And you had this tweet that actually did really well. We got lots of impressions on this, which is Claudia Sheinbaum announcing that Ken Salazar. So we've talked a lot about Ken Salazar. We all know who he is. He's the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, but he really committed a pretty major faux pas, directly intervening in the internal affairs, which, from a diplomatic point of view, is never to be done, and particularly sensitive when it comes to the Mexican relationship with the United States, obviously because so much of our relationship is dependent on having, a productive, cooperative, respectful dynamic between the two countries. You know, there's still many antiquated attitudes in the United States where they think they can tell us what to do. But in this case, he definitely overstepped the line, and there's no consequence of it. You know, I'm surprised actually that this didn't happen sooner. It actually didn't happen previously under López Obrador. But Claudia Sheinbaum putting her mark and saying, you are no longer allowed to speak to the secretaries of government, so the ministers in other countries, the members of the cabinet, unless you go through the foreign affairs ministry first, which is actually the way that things are done quite commonly in most of the world. Ken Salazar, I think, he thinks of himself as a charismatic man, you know, the cowboy and wearing the hat, and he holds his press conferences there in the embassy and things like that. And I think he probably had some influence, more so over some members of the government than others, and definitely used that to try to drive a wedge between the different members of the government, which obviously has a wide gamut of views and ideology, frankly. And I think he was probably playing his cards to try to advance the U.S. interest, to put it in a respectful way, by talking to one person and then talking to another. A bit of a Game of Thrones kind of dynamic. You know, whose secrets am I going to tell? Well, that's come to an end. If he wants to speak to anybody in the government, now he has to go through a formal process and request it. Obviously, if someone's available and it's important to the bilateral relationship, I'm sure he'll have the opportunity to talk with them directly, but he can't go picking up his phone and calling whoever he feels like and requesting a meeting the way he has been doing previously.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Jose Luis. And I agree with you. This is a measure that is long overdue, right? We've talked about before on the program about how Ken Salazar, right, former Interior Secretary and fossil fuel lobbyist and fracking enthusiast, has come down to Mexico and has tried to remake himself as a green energy maven, right? Which is really amusing and ironic, considering his fossil fuel past in the United States and his lobbying for that and his work as a lawyer. Right? And his terrible record in the Interior Department. So there have been kind of two major flashpoints with Salazar since he became ambassador in 2021. Right? The first was around the energy reform. At the time, López Obrador was attempting to do what exactly Morena is doing right now with its 2/3 majority, which is assert more public control over Mexico's energy grid, right? Through the Ley de la Industria Eléctrica, the electric industry law. First, AMLO tried to go with an executive order. That was batted back, raised it up to a law. That was batted back. All right, so now you're going to get a constitutional amendment. And that's a really interesting way of how to approach using power, right? He tried with the least kind of invasive measure that was batted back. All right. Instead of just backing off, you step it up. And then you step it up again. So now we're seeing the final consequence of that right now. What Salazar did at the time was, as a fresh ambassador here in Mexico, is openly say that I have doubts, I don't like this isn't good, right? He tried to, wrap himself in the mantle of green energy, which is essentially a greenwashing scheme so that multinationals can continue to cannibalize the grid, with their, green energy brochures and portfolios and such, as we've talked about, plenty. And he became this very peripatetic kind of campaigner. You'd see him meeting governors. You'd see him going here. You'd see him going there. You'd see him having press conferences with energy executives, right? That's not what an ambassador is supposed to do. Be basically leading a campaign against a measure that's before the Mexican Congress. So that was obviously, seen for what it was in National Palace. And as we've argued, AMLO, I think, was too accommodating, right? You saw Salazar basically going into National Palace once a week or sometimes multiple times a week for meetings with, officials and the president and this and that, right? All they spent a lot of time explaining that, there's still going to be private investment in the energy sector and, shalala. And it led to, eventually, the Supreme Court, with two members of the Supreme Court batting back the law, right? Just two members, as we've talked about, right? I mean, just talk about the utter corruption of the system, right? They didn't even get to a majority in that, but they used a mechanism to rule the law effectively unconstitutional based on a bottom. So, fast forward to the last few months of AMLO's term, and Ken comes out again. And says, first, as we've talked about, he said, the judicial reform is great. I don't mind. It's Mexico's deal. In Colorado, we have, confirmatory elections for judges. And, I was involved in that process. And he just kind of talks a lot. And then he got his, somebody gave him the line from up above in Washington. And he came out with that communique and press conference saying, oh, no, the judicial reform is terrible, even though I said the opposite last week. Right, and it's bad, and it's going to undermine judicial independence and judicial autonomy, and all of the arguments that we've picked apart already. We don't have to go through again, right? And this is right at the time that the Congress was taking that up, right? This the constitutional amendment, right? Which passed and is now in the Constitution. It's in the Constitution. It's there. So AMLO at that point, his patience, very long patience, finally ran out. And said, we're on pause with Ken Salazar. Ken's in timeout, right? So that's the way it was until the end of AMLO's term. Dr. Sheinbaum comes into power. And, very quickly, we're talking about a question of her second week in power. The question comes up, about this, right? And she says very diplomatically, with the poker face that she has, we had some meetings and we figured out that the most organized way of doing it is that for the ambassador to talk to the Cancilleria, the Foreign Relations Ministry, if he wants to have, dealings with other cabinet offices. Right? That's it. Right? She framed it as we're trying to organize things and do things in a more orderly manner. But it's very clear, right? As I put in the tweet over here, and this is a very common phrase in Mexico, entrar como Juan por su casa, o entrar como Pedro por su casa. This is going in like Juan or Pedro in his own house. It's the idea of being too confianzudo, or going into somebody else's house as if it were yours. Right, that's the idea of entrar como Pedro or Juan por su casa. So I put here, ya nada de entrar como Ken por su casa, right? No more of Ken going in like Juan or Pedro por su casa. And that's what this is about. That's what this is about, right? This is about the U.S. ambassador understanding that, he has to obey very certain and, very basic limits in how the relationship is going to be channeled in this administration. Right? And it's not unlike the national security law that AMLO's administration passed in that same 2021, which says that if the DEA is going to be doing something here in Mexico, they have to be informing what's going on with a Mexican government official. It's the same thing. It's the same principle, right? Nada de DEA por su casa. Interesting that another DEA agent was just sentenced for collusion with drug trafficking in the United States. That's 16 DEA officers charged with federal offenses in the last decade.
Yeah.
Right? Another underreported story. So that's the principle, right? You have to, you have to sign in and you have to check in and you have to, there has to be a register of what's going on. Otherwise, Ken's going to go out with his 10-gallon hat, right, and his roadshow, and attempt to basically, set policy on his own, right, Jose Luis?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said during the intro, right? It's a bit like Game of Thrones, right? He'll talk to this person and then he'll talk to this other person and then he'll try to play them against each other and he'll lean on the ones that he has a closer personal relationship with. It's not appropriate behavior for what is a diplomatic post. There are certain limits to what an ambassador can do. And obviously, he has shown himself to be someone who's willing to cross those lines. And I think it's absolutely appropriate. Though it's been kind of funny to see the response by some people. I saw this comment here where somebody quite innocently asked, doesn't it make sense for Mexico to channel everything through foreign affairs? Isn't that how it's handled in the U.S.? And the truth is it's handled in most of the world. Right. I think a lot of gringos sort of got spoiled and used to how things operated in the neoliberal period, where the political leaders at the time were more than happy to throw open the doors of the country and let anybody in who was interested in extracting resources and super exploiting the labor here. And frankly, that's just not the way that things are done. But I thought this answer here by this individual, Adriana Gomez, was actually quite telling. The U.S.-Mexico relation has so many angles that it's always helpful to develop relationships across all relevant officials: security, trade, energy, agriculture, migration, environment, etc. Otherwise, you create unnecessary bottlenecks. And we see the correspondent for Reforma agreed. Indeed, the U.S.-Mexico relationship is way too complex. I think it's actually quite disappointing to see this kind of response trying to justify what isn't really justifiable behavior. No one is saying you're not allowed to engage with the government on files that you deem important for your country that you're representing. But it is inappropriate what Ken Salazar was doing. It wasn't the first time, and he's likely prone to do it again. In fact, he was very quick to go out and meet with his friends just after this leash was put on him. But it's kind of an exaggeration to say that the relationship is too complex for it to be only handled through one ministry. Sure, it's an important relationship. There's lots of layers to it. And yeah, there's different kind of portfolios that fall under this. But the truth is that if it really was so complex, why does it have to all go through Ken Salazar? Why does everything have to go through one individual? There are representatives that are dedicated to trade, that are bureaucrats inside of the U.S. Embassy. They can handle these files. It doesn't always have to be the top level engagement. It's also not particularly appropriate. I think if the secretaries are going to make time to receive people that are interested in intervening on a subject matter, first and foremost, it should be Mexicans. right? It should be the people who are going to be directly impacted by this and not give this privileged position to Ken Salazar, who's convinced that, he's more important than he is. And I think, as I mentioned, it's quite telling because we saw quite literally the day after Sheinbaum announced that everything has to do with
look.
he went to Nayarit to go visit the governor there, right? And he issues a statement and he takes his picture and he's wearing his guayabera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is what he does. This is what he does. He goes and crosses lines he shouldn't be crossing. No one's saying you shouldn't do it, but respect Mexican sovereignty. They don't quite get it through their heads.
No, they don't. And it's as if to say, all right, you say I can't talk to cabinet ministers, I'll go talk to governors. It's like, oh, come on. That's not something you do the day after.
Yeah.
It's just U.S. arrogance that seeps into everything, and they just don't get it.
No. And I wonder what this, if there really will be any kind of fallout or any kind of consequence in terms of the bilateral relationship. I would argue no. And in fact, tomorrow, so this is October 14th when we're recording, this will come out on October 15th, there's a big delegation of investors, of people, of U.S. capital interests coming to Mexico to discuss these issues. Nothing about the U.S. relationship is going to be shattered by this. And that's kind of the narrative that they've been trying to really perpetuate, especially around the judicial reform, the new constitution, which specifies the direct election of judges, that, it's scaring away investment. And that seems to be the point they're driving home, to the point that actually one of the spokespersons for the judicial workers has actually been trying to blackmail the government, saying that if you don't do this, we're going to call on people not to invest. So again, it's this idea that, and we'll get to this also in Losers and Haters, that Mexico, because it's charting a different path, deserves to be punished, and we have to, really think about the relationship and really, our investors wise to be coming here. Now they're limiting the ambassador. It's all part of responding to that narrative that, the relationship is at risk. Frankly, it is a complicated one, but it's a healthy one. Things are fine between the U.S. government, and even if the occupant of the White House changes next year, the relationship will stay the same.
And just to kind of put a dot on this, does anybody honestly think that the representative of an imperial power right to the north that has a long history of interventionism in Mexican affairs, dating back not only decades, but, century and a half, should have carte blanche to go into any secretary's office that he or she wants on a whim? Does anybody think that that's a smart idea for the Mexican government to do? Of course not. Of course not. This is the most basic restriction that should exist, right? And it should exist for any ambassador. You have to go through the foreign relations, secretariat, and then you can have, the meeting that you need.
Yeah. I wonder what it's like in Canada. I lived many years in Canada, but I don't remember the U.S. ambassador to Canada dropping in to Parliament Hill, several times a week. So I think it responds a bit to that kind of colonial mindset. As we know, there are a lot of people. The Speaker of the House right now in the United States has a very arrogant attitude that, he's convinced the U.S. can tell Mexico what to do whenever it feels like. There was that famous quote. He says, Mr. President, this is the United States. You will do as we say. No, we won't. No, we won't. And in fact, we'll put an even tighter leash on you if you don't respect that. Maybe you shouldn't be allowed to meet with governors either. Maybe that should run by the Foreign Affairs Ministry. I think I've told this joke before on the show, so forgive me if it's familiar. But, Kurt, how come there's never been a coup d'etat in the United States?
I don't know, Jose Luis. Why not?
Because there's no U.S. embassy in the United States.
We need a classic joke. We need a hat trick. We need a little bit of a...
Well, I'm slowly converting my house into a recording studio. I feel bad for my family members here, so maybe we can put a drum set in the corner.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to our next topic here. I'm going to talk about this harasser of women who's crying out that he's the victim. He's the one who's really being persecuted. But I think it speaks actually to a broader trend of the way that again Mexico is being characterized as if it is a regressive, authoritarian, backwards country that silences critics. All right, so we have this cartoonist, Antonio García Nieto, obvious opposition sympathizer. You just need to take a look at what he has to say. His editorial cartoons are very much anti-government, pro-opposition, and you would say that, oh, well, he's always been critical. No, the truth is he's always identified with the right, which is fine. It's his right, freedom of expression. Go ahead. If someone wants to pay you for your garbage, feel free to publish it. But he recently crossed the line. I'll give you the context in a second, but before we get to that, let me just translate what his tweet here is saying. From the halls of power, I am being harassed, intimidated, censured. The persecution of which I am subject to is an excuse of a dictatorship that seeks to get rid of all of those who criticize the regime. It is hard fascism disguised as progressivism. I mean, that's quite a statement. Not only is there intimidation and censorship coming from the state, it's persecution of a dictatorship. Apparently, Mexico is now a dictatorship, according to Garcia Nieto, that's looking to silence all of its critics, but even going so far as to call it fascism. A lot of people use words they don't seem to understand. Now, what is he saying here? Well, as I say above, this man is alleging he's a victim of censorship by a fascist regime because he will now have to answer before the law for sharing a digitally edited picture of a young, current, sitting member of the Senate in a state of undress, which is a crime here in Mexico following the approval of Ley Olimpia a number of years ago, which was a law championed by feminists. What is the Ley Olimpia? It basically says you're not allowed to reproduce or share images without consent. And Garcia Nieto took a digitally edited picture. Now, he claims he didn't make it, but he did share it. And the law covers also sharing of information that is not been consented to, images that have not been consented to, all over social media. And now he's crying that he's the victim because the senator here, name is Andrea Chavez, has decided, as a result of what people have been talking about when it comes to this issue, to proceed criminally, as she should. There cannot be impunity in this. These men are accustomed to harassing women, to doing it freely, to doing it without consequence. And I, for one, I'm glad that she's pursuing the legal case against him to say, this is not appropriate. You broke the law. You should face the consequences. No one is saying the government now is ordering his cartoons to be destroyed or his paper to stop publishing him. That's a decision that private company will make. But I'm really glad that this is part of the public conversation. And I think it's part of it is happening because we have a president, a female president, la presidenta, with A, who's putting that every day, answering those sexist critiques. The age of tolerance of this kind of abusive behavior is behind us. Get with the times, Garcia Nieto. Your behavior is wildly inappropriate, and you are not the victim here.
And it's not only Garcia Nieto, it's the El Financiero newspaper. I mean, this is a major newspaper in Mexico, right? That has him as their caricaturist and has backed him up on this. Effectively backed him up on this. Right? Just to kind of show the level of rot there in the Mexican corporate media on these kinds of issues. Right? Just to give a little bit more background too, the Olimpia law, this initiative began a decade or so ago. By a young woman in Puebla who had some sexually intimate images of her shared, I believe, by a former partner online, which led to, as things were 10 years ago, just mountains and mountains of abuse and burla, right? Which led her to depression and considering. And she instead became a campaigner for this law, right? Which basically says, as Jose Luis laid out, you can't, share intimate images or videos of someone without their consent online. I mean, it's quite clear, right? So that became a law in most states and has now become a national law as well, right? And it just kind of goes to show, and we talked about kind of, and I mentioned at the end of my Jacobin piece, right? It's kind of, women in power in Mexico face these kinds of things in everywhere, but all the time. And that, Claudia Sheinbaum is becoming the first female president. She's talked about her own, she had an encounter, I think, in university where a professor tried to make a very inappropriate pass. I mean, it's happened to so many people. And so she backed up Andrea Chavez on this. Right? But what's really sad is if you look at some of this Garcia Nieto's other tweets, it's not just a one-off. It's not just a one-off on this guy's part, right? He's talked about this idea of right here, right? This idea of this play on words, a senator of the Republic, and he actually claimed that she herself had put up this doctored photo. That was his lie. That was his original lie. Right before he started claiming victim, he said, "No, she put it up. She put it up in her account." Right, which was the first lie. And he's also made degrading tweets about the now president of Morena, right, suggesting that AMLO is sleeping around. Just nonsense stuff. And his the phrase putonas del bienestar, or whores of bienestar, or well-being, right, just the well-being programs of the government, has now become a hashtag because of him, in large part. Right? Now, where do you draw the line, obviously? Because as reprehensible as a lot of this is, and all the more so coming from a political cartoonist at a major newspaper, a lot of this nonsense is covered by free speech, right? If you want to say something nasty or stupid, or
Sure.
all of us journalists are routinely insulted on Twitter. That's free speech, however dumb it is. But the Olympia law says the line is drawn when you share intimate material for someone without their consent. And that's actually now become a model for laws in like Argentina, and I think it's been taken up in other international bodies.
El Salvador just passed its own, I think, version of that law, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. So that's where we are in this. When they say it's a time of transformation, it's a time of women, this is the kind of crap women get all the time.
Yeah.
Doctored photos. And actually the picture, the face of Andrea Chavez that they put on the doctored photo, she was underage at that point, as she mentioned in an interview, right? So it's actually doubly a problem because they took an underage photo, face photo of her to put on that doctored photo. And it was so clearly doctored, and people were saying in the comments, it's a doctored photo. He didn't take it down either.
He eventually did. He eventually apologized.
He left it there for quite a while.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to this video here where she's talking about her decision, because she actually shares an audio from one of her constituents, from a young woman who says, "I'm interested in politics thanks to you. And so you have to stand up to this," because it's true. I mean, Andrea Chavez, she's occupied important posts. She's a young woman, but she's clearly a rising star within the party. I think, she's tough. She's got thick skin, right? But not everybody does. And I think if we're talking about this being el tiempo de mujeres, the time for women, then this needs to be an example of, right? Here she's reading it out. "And thanks to you, I know that things can change. I will always help you. I will always back you in the decisions, but I'm very worried because if they can do this to you, what can we expect for the rest of us?" And I think that's a very good point. And then she says that was what convinced her. So I'm glad that somebody who's able to withstand this kind of barrage of sexism and attacks and misogyny is going up against it. And I think one of the things that's been really disturbing, I think, about this is the way that this individual has responded. And this is just a selection of some of his tweets in response. He's obviously now acting like, "Oh, a contrition, and I'm sorry, and I apologize, et cetera, et cetera." But quite literally, he wrote to Cayetana Alvarez Toledo, who is a Spanish right-wing senator. "I need help. Please let me know. How could I get in touch with you?" And then says, "I am writes to the United Nations saying, I am being persecuted because I am criticizing the government, et cetera, et cetera. And now I'm going to ask for political asylum." I mean, I don't know how serious he is in these kinds of tweets, but even if he is sort of tongue-in-cheek about calling for the need for asylum and all of this, I mean, it's pretty disrespectful about people who are actually facing persecution. And the worst part for me is that it drives this narrative about a repressive authoritarian state that's going after its critics. Right? A line was crossed. But I'd be interested to hear your reaction, because I know that you've been critical about some of this gender-based political violence that's been used against sitting politicians. We know there's the famous case of the one-time presidential candidate who ended up losing his political rights as a result of this. How do you reconcile, the fact that, there's a line that has been drawn in the Mexican law, but sometimes this could be used in a regressive way to actually silence people and actually affect free speech in this country?
Right. It becomes a thorny issue. I've written about this actually in Sentido Común, right? When former diputado Gabriel Cuadri, conservative and misogynist, and has also, said nonsense about how Mexico would be better if it didn't have its southern states, right? All this kind of crap. The National Electoral Institute was actually trying to prevent him from running for office, for running for re-election, because of gender-based speech, and this is where it becomes problematic, right? Nobody is in favor of what Cuadri said, but I argued at the time, and I maintain this, that Cuadri should not have been stripped of his right to run for office, and that was the decision of the voters. And as it turned out, he ran for re-election and lost. So I was very happily vindicated on that because it was the voters who had the final say. And that was also being used from the National Electoral Institute against, Morena senators, including this same Andrea Chavez. And they were accusing women of gender-based speech, right? As an attempt to try to strip people from the ability to run for office. So that's when it becomes a whole other issue, right? When they use it as a club to try to strip, people of their ability to run for office, right? So, what's said in the heat of a debate, you have to defend that in front of the voters, right? The Olympia law is very specifically about sharing compromising and intimate material online about someone without their consent. And I see them to be two very clear issues, right? Mm-hmm. But we have to watch out, right? Because, with, trying to use the argument of one, some people can use it for bad ends in the other direction. And actually, Andrea Chavez has actually been on the receiving ends of both of those.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving on to our next topic, we want to talk about a pretty important decision that happened here in Mexico that effectively speaks to the rollback of neoliberalism here in the country. So here's the headline from La Jornada. Pemex, the state-backed oil company, and Comisión Federal de Electricidad, the state-owned utility company, electricity, have recovered their essence as public companies. So you might want to ask yourself, well, Pemex was always public, and la Comisión Federal de Electricidad, CFE, has always been public. Well, the truth is there was an important change that happened during the neoliberal era where they ceased being public companies and became instead productive, publicly owned companies. And the difference might be subtle, but it's actually really important.
Very important. Yeah.
And the difference is basically public companies serve a public good. So their aim is not to generate profits. It's not to provide, service in exchange for the gathering, the building up of capital, et cetera, et cetera. Public companies meant to serve a public good, which means that they exist not to fulfill a bottom line, but actually meet the needs of the population. So obviously, it's a little bit easier to explain when it comes to the electricity company. Access to electricity is a right, and it should be made affordable and accessible. Obviously, in a country as big as Mexico with a large territory, making sure that the electricity actually makes it into rural communities, that it is still charged at an affordable rate, that it is subsidized essentially by the state, because if it was left in private hands, well, many communities would not receive service, or if they did, they would be exorbitantly priced. Same with the state-owned oil company. It's not just about, this is an oil company that extracts oil, but it's actually designed to be part of the broader project of defending the country's sovereignty, having energy independence, energy sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. So the change is subtle, but the change is important. And it's been interesting to see some of the conversation around this. And the reason I wanted to talk about it on the program today is that I saw some commentators there saying, look at how things are regressing in Mexico. Look at how regressive that is. The only way that a change like this could be viewed as regressive is if you consider neoliberalism to be progressive. This idea that the state should not intervene in the economy, but instead actually should just be another actor and be subject to the constraints of the market, et cetera, which is the way that this country was governed for several decades, but at the cost of the well-being of the population, right? The Comisión Federal de Electricidad, the state-owned utility company in particular, was the subject of intense scrutiny because it was where they actually made significant advances in terms of privatizing electricity generation in this country, and also, doing that on the back of the population, which suddenly had to pay higher rates and had less accessible service, right? I remember the debates around that. This was during Felipe Calderón, where they talked about it, and it was a slogan for a long time, una empresa de clase mundial, right? A world-class company, trying to convince us that, this is where the world is heading, that privatization, and you'll have to pay private companies for everything. But, they're going to generate electricity using, green or more sustainable initiatives, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, time proved that to be an absolute farce. What it was a means of facilitating the accumulation of capital for private interests in this country. That's how things work in places like Spain, where I think you shared on your Twitter account, the actual bill comes directly from Iberdrola.
That's right.
It doesn't come from a state utility. It comes from Iberdrola. I mean, that is the height of neoliberalism, which obviously, anybody who's a working class person who's lived through the last 30 years, the political economy of the last 30 years, understands what this means. What it is making your life more expensive for the benefit of private capital.
And actually, the Spanish example is illustrative because, Iberdrola runs the show in Spain, and European Union, rules, competition rules, tie the hands of the Spanish government to try to do anything about the exorbitant rates that they charge, right? And that was basically the idea here. What they did in the 2013 counter reform, right? That was the time when López Obrador suffered his heart attack, let us not forget.
Oh, yeah.
Right? They made this big splashy show of we're not privatizing Pemex. We're not privatizing Pemex. But they did in a very subtle way. It remained, a state-owned company, but they shifted it from a public company to a productive company, so they said. So that made it subject to derecho mercantile law, competition rules. Right? And there was even a competition agency set up, right? One of these supposedly autonomous agencies, right? To enforce these kinds of things. So that was the rub there, right? It wasn't privatized nominally, right? It remained as a shell to hand out contracts and farm out areas on land and on sea for private drilling and such. But it became subject to mercantile law. So any attempts to, get it back under public law, they'd say, oh, no, that's anti-competition, right? And then from there, they could attempt to link it to the free trade agreement, right? As they've tried, right? With the electricity law, as we mentioned, with Ken, right? Oh, you can't do that because that affects the rights of the multinationals to come into Mexico. You see? So anything they try to do to reinforce the public character of these enterprises, public enterprises, runs afoul of mercantile law, anti-competition. Anti-competition. Tie your hands, just like the European Union does with nation states over there. Right? Try to lock this stuff in. Try to lock this stuff in so that it could never be reversed. Right? Which Chomsky said back in the 90s was the main goal of the free trade agreement in the first place, to lock things in so that no progressive government in the future could ever undo them. You see it very clearly here with the attempts to do it in the energy sector, which is why when they renegotiated the free trade agreement, AMLO's incoming government negotiated the exclusion of the energy industry from that agreement very specifically.
That's right. There's an explicit article saying that Mexicans can decide what they want to do with their energy resources. And of course, there have also been those voices saying, well, this is going to lead us to the dark days of, state-led development, et cetera, that, these companies are now going to run huge deficits and it's going to be a disaster for, public finances, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that there are certain pillars of the economy that shouldn't be subject to the market. I arguably think we should go much, much further. But even if we're operating by the rules that are available to us in 2024, some of these companies should operate at a deficit, should operate at a loss, because it's a public service.
It's a public service.
And anybody who's ever lost power for 24 hours knows how important electricity is. Anybody who's ever lived in a country where there was a shortage of gasoline in a given moment understands how important having a stable, secure source of energy is. These are priorities. These are strategic interests here at play. And that's why this is actually, contrary to what some voices there are saying that it's regressive, it's actually very progressive. This is the way that things should be done.
That's absolutely right. And here's another example. Here's another example that just came up in the Mañanera on Monday morning, right? Internet.
Right.
The public right to internet, right? So they're now building out internet nationally, right? Everywhere in the country. Just like in the day, the Federal Electricity Commission got electricity to just about every remote pueblo in this country. And anyone who's traveled through Mexico understands how much of a feat that is, right? I mean, there are pueblos that are, 8 hours walking away from the closest road, right? And they have electricity. It's not like the United States, which is, aside from the Appalachians and, of course, the mountains in New England and the Rockies, large swaths of the United States are flat and easy to get to. Mexico is a very mountainous country with 2 major mountain ranges going right down the backbone of the country. It's very difficult, geographically to do these kind of things. And that's what the Federal Electricity Commission built out publicly, right? Because what private industry would ever have done that? None of them. They never would have done it. Private industry would never have electrified Mexico, right? Just think of the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States. And it took public, even in the capital of privatization, it took public enterprises to electrify the rural United States. Well, all the more so for Mexico, considering how geographically challenging it is. That's such an important point that people miss. And so you take that and you extrapolate that to the internet issue now. Do you think, what private internet company is going to bring internet to a mountainous pueblo with 100 people 5 hours away from a road? Of course they won't, because it's not profitable. That's why there aren't banks anywhere near those pueblos. And people have to go to cities to bank and travel hours, which is why they put in the Bancos de Bienestar, right? Private industry won't do these things. They won't electrify. They won't bring banks. They won't bring services, and they won't bring the internet. What they will do is, jump on like parasites onto the infrastructure once it's already there. They're very good at doing that. And they're also very good at cherry picking. They say, all right, well, the public service can do these unprofitable areas, but we need to do the profitable areas. You see? Totally desleal, right? That's what cherry picking is all about. Oh, of course, we'll do it here in the big city. We won't do it out there. The government can do that. Or they can build the infrastructure so that we can then jump in and do it. These are examples of market failure, right? The market won't bring internet to the country. And actually, the rules were set up such that the federal government couldn't bring internet to the country. It would have to do it through a private company to not run afoul of these competition rules. So as the president pointed out in the Mañanera on Monday, it's not just electricity and Pemex, it's also internet. There can now be a public internet service that doesn't run afoul of mercantile law and these, competition rules run amok. That was preventing, even here in the city of Oaxaca, they couldn't set up the CFE, the Federal Electricity Commission couldn't set up its internet service. It offers internet service. No, it runs afoul of competition rules. Well, now it's going to be able to have a public internet service, and you can choose. You can have your public internet, the famous public option. You can have your public internet service, or you can stay with your private company if you're happy with your private company. Because in the city, we can choose. In the pueblos, you can't choose, because no private company is going to go and give you internet. None. Not even close. And the federal government was prevented from doing such a basic thing by these silly competition rules that was, preventing the development of the country. That's
exactly
why
it.
all of this is so important.
That really what it boils down to. It actually ends up being a barrier to development, to
Yeah.
progress, to the advancement of people's well-being. And I think it's worth saying explicitly. It's interesting. You're right. In the history of this country, it was the Federal Electricity Commission that electrified the country, and they're the ones who are tasked with bringing internet everywhere because
Right.
they have the infrastructure, because they have the telephone poles, they can run the wires, they can provide the service. During the neoliberal era, we were promised through institutes like the IFT, the IFT, which was meant to guarantee competition and bring down prices, right? That this was the grand solution to the connectivity issue. It didn't work. It wasn't delivered. Who has 5G service here? It's always the big cities, right? It's obviously that's where the money is, and so that's where they invest to the detriment of the rest of the population. And ultimately, it never actually brought down the prices of internet or cell phone use. It's still pretty much the same as it was 6 years ago. I haven't seen the famous competition actually driving it, which is actually because what it actually does is protect these firms from being able to be the only actors in the country. Mexico's it's a middle income country, but it pays some of the highest rates for internet. It's much, much cheaper in other places in Latin America because they don't have, these neoliberal institutions. So think of that too when you hear about, they're dismantling all these independent agencies, which is actually one of the things that's coming up in the Congress soon. Well, it's because they never really complied with what they were meant to do. It was always bluster. It was all lies to convince them, for the population to be like, no, this neoliberal agenda is actually good for you. No, well, that era is behind us now.
And if you're watching this program from a rural area in the United States and you have shitty internet, know that you very likely have shitty internet because many municipalities in the United States have tried to set up municipal internet service and have had everything thrown against them. From these big, internet firms. So they couldn't set up municipal internet. But at the same time, Comcast and all these companies don't want us, provide internet to small towns because it's not profitable. But of course, they don't want municipalities setting it up because it's a bad precedent. So you're left with shitty rural internet. That's what this kind of stuff is designed to, to solve. What's happening in Mexico.
Maybe if the U.S. had directly elected judges, you would actually vote against the monopolies.
Hey, there's an idea.
All right. So we're going to talk about good news from Mexico. And we're going to start with a very curious headline. So be patient with me because it starts like the usual articles about Mexico in the English language media. Snubbed by Tesla. Mexican government pledges to create its own small, affordable electric car. Now, first of all, it has nothing to do with Tesla. This decision by the government at the federal level was not because Tesla abandoned its plans, but it actually obeys a very different logic, which is more telling in this headline. Mexico aims to develop local supply chain for EV production. What this actually is about is creating an integrated system of production where the value added part of that chain is actually taking place in Mexico. So not to get too much into the political economy of global South countries, but we've talked about that on the program. And then one of the things that the way that the international economic order is enforced is by resigning the countries of the global South, which are rich in resources, expensive resources, to only be producers of primary materials. And so Mexico, as an example, produces lithium. It doesn't, but let's assume that it does. Though that lithium would then be taken to a different country to then be processed to be made into something usable like a battery. And then that battery is put into a car, and that car is where the value added is. And that's actually where the real money is.
It's getting there with this lithium. It's just a question of extracting it, right?
Yeah, it's getting there. But we're talking about cars. I figured I'd use that as an example, right? And what the Mexican government is proposing is have the natural resources that are necessary to build a car, but also have the production and the actual sales for domestic market, making an affordable vehicle for Mexicans so that they can participate in what is the global trend towards more electric vehicles. But to go back to the AP story here, right? Snubbed by Tesla. Elon Musk said in July that the company had paused plans for a plant in Mexico, citing Donald Trump's remarks about possible auto tariffs. The interesting thing about this is that there was a lot of fanfare. There was a lot of noise when Musk, I think he even came to Mexico. He went to Nuevo León and met with the governor to promote their, big new plan. In fact, somebody did the homework and found out that Tesla never spent $1 in Mexico, except for maybe paying for Elon Musk's flight and hotel and whatever else, and his meals and his entourage. But other than that, there was actually no actual investment, despite the fact that the government of Nuevo León, led by Samuel Garcia from the opposition Movimiento Ciudadano, rolled out the red carpet and they feted this grotesque man. I have zero respect for Elon Musk. He's a fascist. He's becoming a fascist before our very eyes. But it's funny the way that the headline manipulates the story, because if we scroll to quite literally the last paragraph, we see what Musk said fully. And I'll quote him here. I think you just need to see where things stand after the election. Trump has said that he will put heavy tariffs on vehicles produced in Mexico. So it doesn't make sense to invest a lot in Mexico if that's going to be the case. A couple of points here. Number one, Musk did not make this decision because of potential tariffs. Musk made this decision largely because he has aligned himself with Donald Trump and his proto-fascist project for the United States. In fact, they used to not like each other. There's lots of tweets where Donald Trump is openly criticizing Elon Musk and talking about how he begged for support, etc. Musk obviously had a shift, and he is aligning his interests as an owner of capital, as a member of the bourgeoisie, with the forces that he thinks will best allow him to accumulate capital, which in this case, in the United States today, is Donald Trump and his proto-fascist project. And the other point I wanted to make on this, which is that, so we have a free trade agreement. Auto is a huge chunk of that free trade agreement. It's a huge, huge part of it. Obviously, for a long time, as a result of the first free trade agreement, there was a development of production lines here in Mexico, but for export, for the U.S. market above all. But it explicitly specifies what tariffs can or cannot be applied, right? And it's been really interesting how AP can publish something about this, treating it as if it isn't the lie that it is. Musk saying one thing, but actually the true motivations are other. But also, this whole point around the free trade agreement has been one of the things that they've been really harping on around the judicial reform, around the change to the judicial branch of government in Mexico, which is they've been saying, oh, this undermines USMCA, this is going to make investors nervous, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, it's quite explicit. The tariffs that can be applied to vehicles produced in Mexico are very, very explicit, and they cannot be. And eventually, if they did try to do it, would be resolved through the mechanisms that are in that free trade agreement. But when it comes to Mexico deciding its sovereignty, an internal matter, right? Mexicans deciding if they want to change the way that their judicial branch works. Oh, in that case, we can invoke the free trade agreement. It's a stunning case of hypocrisy, and all because, again, what do they want to do? They want to develop a supply chain here. They want to develop a local market. They want to make vehicles that are affordable to Mexicans. They want to make sure that all of that wealth that is going to be created as a result of the transition to more electric vehicles that's going to take place throughout the world, that we get a part of it, that we don't just get resigned to export of primary materials so that some other auto company can get rich.
It's such a symbolic issue, isn't it, Jose Luis? And it seems so intuitive, right? Why can't a country use its own resources to develop its own products? But that is how the entire world economic system has been set up to avoid, right? The entire, duality between core and periphery. The core can have value-added technology. The core can have this. The core, right? It's like the horror, right? Of Kurtz, right? But the periphery cannot. And if the periphery gets uppity enough to try to dare to use its own resources to develop its own products, well then, as Musk himself said with regards to the, Bolivia coup in 2019, we'll coup whoever we want, deal with it. And that's the history of Latin America writ large. It was United Fruit in Guatemala well before it even got to the point of a car, right? So this idea that you can use your own technology for your own people is the number one threat to the world order. And hence you see these headlines in AP, these nasty things, and you'll see a campaign built up. I remember when I was a kid, this might have been before your time, Jose Luis. This might have been before your time, when Yugoslavia, the unaligned country of Yugoslavia back in the 80s, developed its own car, the Yugo.
The Yugo, of course.
The media campaign against the Yugo was relentless. Relentless, the media campaign against the Yugo, making fun of it, just the sarcasm, the idea that if it just hit something, it would explode on contact. It was a relentless media campaign to belittle the idea that Yugoslavia could come up with its own car. And it was a very successful media campaign. I mean, the Yugo became a laughingstock in the United States. That's the degree of this idea of a threat. And this is in the heart of Europe, not even much more so the case in the real global south, and Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, right? That's the degree of the threat this represents, right? So it's so important, right? This idea, and it goes along with what Claudia Sheinbaum has been saying since the campaign of putting more of an emphasis on science and more of an emphasis on on technology and development and all of that. But watch out, right? Because it's good news in the sense of Mexico should have its own car and a lot of other things, right? It's going to be called the Olinea, which is a Nahuatl word for movement, as you were telling me just before the show, right? It's supposed to be kind of a sleek, compact car, affordable within the range of what electric cars cost, which are more than gasoline-powered cars, right? But cheaper than the comparable Tesla model, and somewhat in the range of what BDV is charging for their cars from China. So it's exciting, but just wait for the backlash on this one.
Oh, absolutely. Not to get too much into geopolitics, right? But why is China now a rival? Because it stopped accepting the terms that was being imposed on it. Oh, no, you don't get any of the value-added parts. So they're like, no, yes, we do. We now control the intellectual property, and we're going to produce our own things. You mentioned BYD as an example. Elon Musk used to make fun of BYD. Oh, have you seen their cars? And now they've overtaken Tesla. They are the largest.
Cheaper, better, a lot more.
They're better cars.
They're better cars and cheaper. And that's just the bottom line on that. And your point is so well taken, right? What they want, and this was the conservative model in Mexico, is Mexico to be a sweatshop country. Just a sweatshop country. And China finally rejected the model of being the eternal sweatshop and said, well, no, if you're going to relocate here, we want technology transfer. Yeah. So why can't Mexico have technology transfer? Why can't it reverse engineer or develop its own?
Yeah.
Right. And, and the eternal sweatshop model, because that's what the United States wants.
That's right. And I think it's worth highlighting also like the role that the state is playing, right? This is happening because it's a state-led initiative. In fact, if we see this quote here, we're going to generate supply chains so that everything that is in the electric car is manufactured in the country, and we import as little as possible. There are companies in Mexico that have been making electric motors for a long time. So the idea is to bring them together with Mexican researchers so they can assemble this electric vehicle, right? Then this is the state playing a protagonist role in the actual economy and the development of new industry and the development of new technologies, et cetera, et cetera. One final note on this, I mentioned this to my partner. She's a researcher, a scientist as well. And it's really interesting to see a woman like Sheinbaum answering these questions, right? She kind of went on a little bit on a tangent about why lithium isn't viable in Mexico as it stands, kind of explaining the difference between the lithium that is found in Mexico and the one that is found in the lithium triangle in South America. It was really interesting, the kind of the really well-informed, but also kind of didactic way that she was explaining it. It's a nice thing to have in the morning press conferences as well. Again, this is a bit of Claudia Sheinbaum's touch, right? The way that she approaches some of these questions as well. I'm really grateful to see that. And I think there's a lot of people in the country who are also grateful to have, that detailed explanation that comes from somebody who knows what they're talking about, right? That's who's in charge today. All right. One final thing. We're almost at the end here. Losers and haters picking on David Frum. All right. Let me just show you the headline real quick.
It's just too fun. It's just too fun. We couldn't have won.
Women can be autocrats too. Mexico's new president follows her predecessor's authoritarian path. I'll just read the beginning here. Wow. Mexico sworn in its first woman president. This looks like a bold step for equality and progress. All the more impressive because the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, is of Jewish origin. But Mexico is not advancing towards an egalitarian future. It is regressing into an authoritarian past. All right, there's a piece here. I mean, I all know the reasons why. David Frum's an idiot. He can go fuck himself. But there's a piece here that you wanted to break down where he talks about just like open misogyny, just the grossest kind of example of these attitudes that these conservative thinkers have.
Yeah, it's right here as you have it on the screen. Frum doesn't deserve the time of any thinking serious person on Mexico, nor Anne Applebaum, nor Katzenberg, nor The Atlantic, nor the entire utterly discredited U.S. media establishment over their coverage of the genocide in Israel, in Palestine, by Israel and Palestine. Right? None of these people deserve any serious consideration as serious journalists, right? But it's particularly funny with Frum, who has just this visceral hatred of Lopez Obrador. So it's like he's down in the basement in his underwear, just kind of, just crazily, just knocking out one piece after the other, one piece after the other, one piece after the other, and they're not working, and he's going to do another one, and another one, and another one, and that's it, right? And they just get more unhinged as they go along. They just get more unhinged as they go along, right? So in this piece, he's playing up this, panista conservative idea that AMLO is going to be the power behind the throne. There's going to be a maximato here, like in the days of Calles, right? And you can tell when someone is so ignorant of a country, but they try to pass themselves off as knowledgeable about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's just so pathetic. And so what it says over here, talking about what we were talking about before with regards to facing misogyny and, it's time for a transformation, it's a time for women in the case of Andrea Chavez, just look at this. He says, Lopez Obrador's power was based not only on his legal authority as president, but also on his personal charisma and his complex and mysterious arrangement with the cartels. Okay, this is playing up, again, the Narco AMLO crap that came from the DEA leaks. Nothing to back it up, but Frum has no journalistic integrity whatsoever. So, of course, he'll insinuate it again without having the guts to actually come out and, openly affirm the lie. Lopez Obrador could not bequeath that other dimension of his power to a successor, even if he wanted to, and there is no evidence that he did. He favored Sheinbaum over other potential successors because she was the candidate who most lavishly praised Lopez Obrador, because that's what women do. They lavishly praise men. And his fourth transformation of Mexican society, Lopez Obrador may also have gambled that by choosing the least magnetic successor with the smallest personal following, he might best extend his own hold on popularity beyond the end of his term. Can you believe this now? Can you believe this now? Claudia Sheinbaum is the least magnetic successor with the smallest personal following. Well,
I don't think that's true.
I think first of all, the opinion polls that got her the nomination would say otherwise. Her performance in the campaign would say otherwise. Her performance in the first 2 weeks of the Mañanera would say otherwise. And the performance on the poll that we have on the screen would say otherwise. Jose Luis, what does that say?
I mean, it's right there for us, and it's from our friends over there at De las Eras Demotecnia. That's the polling firm that we trust the most here at Soberania, which found this. It was just published this morning on October 14th. 90% of Mexicans think Claudia Sheinbaum will be a good president, and 89% think the country's going to do better. I mean, that's all you really need to know. You could say that's the honeymoon period, but, if we were to believe David Frum that she lacks Lopez Obrador's charisma and magnetism, and that, the reason that he hand chose her, even though he didn't, was because he could swoop in and get rid of her if he needed. Well, if that was the plan, it's not working out because she's extraordinarily popular on her own merits. Right?
The least magnetic of his successors with the smallest personal following, right? just, to put this in perspective of what we talked about, earlier on the program, and just to show how the U.S. corporate media establishment is just degrading before our eyes. It's just falling apart. It's just crumbling. It's just sad and disgusting and putrid, and you want to look away, but you kind of can't, because we have to cover this stuff, because we're journalists, right? This kind of nasty, sleazy, misogynistic interpretation of Sheinbaum from the same person whose speeches led to the deaths of 1 million brown people in the Middle East. And he would love to redo that in Latin America if he could get away with it, but he can't. So he's bitter and angry and just writing this crap like this, one worse than the next. That aside, and to link to what we've talked about also with the cartoonist, this is the danger of when you create this argument that Mexico is, authoritarian and it's a dictatorship and this and that. You then give free rein for people like this idiot cartoonist at El Financiero to plug into that for his own sad ends, right? So the David Fromms of the world, the David Fromm, which are trying to create this authoritarian argument for Mexico, are just giving cover for this disgusting Financiero cartoonist to try to make the same argument, right? So Fromm then spawns his little mini Fromm kind of people within Mexico who said, oh, look, they're trying to ban my cartoons because I can't say whores of Bienestar anymore.
Yep. And as you know what? We saw this response, right? This is what he deserves, right? Not to mention, right? Where is this being published? The Atlantic, which is edited by a former prison guard of the IDF. So let's be serious about who's actually channeling this into the public conversation, right? We have this tweet here. The best proof you're going to get that autocrat and authoritarian now means independent from the US and refusing to be vassalized, right? Mm-hmm. We talked about when Claudia took office that there actually has been one other female head of state in North America, not elected, was selected by her party, Kim Campbell in Canada. Mm-hmm. Funny how the vassal state of Canada didn't get this kind of treatment when Kim Campbell was the prime minister. But otherwise, right, we have this funny tweet from David Adler. The Atlantic goes DEI, and in particular, some of the comments below here. I agree with this take. Atlantic is a mouthpiece of American empire. People making fun of this. I like this one from Women Can Be Autocrats. And by this, I mean Claudia Sheinbaum and not Meloni, because I am a fascist. Can't help but agree with that when it comes to David Frum. Quite a few others here. We have Seth Harp. We featured him in a previous program. What kills Frum about AMLO, Morena, and Sheinbaum is that they're actually good at governing and keep getting more popular, while the neoliberal opposition is in shambles.
That's it.
He's absolutely correct.
In a nutshell. Yeah.
That's the situation here. We have also Alan McLeod. Mexican President Lopez Obrador greatly reduced poverty, increased the minimum wage, refused to slavishly follow Washington's orders, and leaves office with a 70% approval rating. So, of course, ghouls like David Frum at the Atlantic consider to be an authoritarian. That's what it's actually about, right? Just look, you mentioned about having to deal with some of these journalists and quotes. The reaction to Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. There was this interview that he did on MSNBC over the weekend where they shared with him the book review written by this racist. I'm not even going to bother remembering her name. But his initial reaction, because he'd never seen it before, was just wide-eyed. He's like, wow, that was really racist. That's who these people are. That's how they react. Anything that kind of shakes the foundations of their imagination of how they think the world would work, which obviously is a world in service of empire and capital, has to be disparaged, name-called, or written off with racist caricatures of people's arguments. I mean, this is the reality we live in. And that's why we're so glad that we have this program and this opportunity to kind of answer that.
Public, this great audience. Right.
We are so grateful to our audience who always tune in and give us support, leaving us our comments. Apologize if some of you have written to us. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. We've got a lot of stuff on our plate. But of course, we're going to be here consistently to try to bring you a different perspective on Mexican politics. As always, like and subscribe, share with your friends, leave us a comment. All of that really helps us out. For all of you members of the St. Patrick's Battalion, thank you again. Your support is invaluable to keeping this program going. And I'll leave it over to you, Kurt. Any last words?
Well, I think people were good today. I think they deserve it. My name is Kurt Hackbot. Here we go. Ready for Jackman and Tito Kamoon. We'll see you next time for another episode of Soberania.